Helmy, take it
Oh,
away.
oh, goodness gracious. I didn't realize that we were on. Okay. Hello, everybody. Glad to be here. I'm Helmy Hesrick, a senior principal with LaSar Development Consulting. And we're here to talk today about a strategy that we call scaling up affordable housing on public land. And I'm joined today with a very distinguished panel of speakers. And I would like to share with you a little bit about their background and why they're here today. So I'm going to begin talking about, for many of you, this is, that I worked for the city of Los Angeles for a number of years before joining LaSar. And while there, faced the concern or the problem that we could never scale housing, affordable housing, to meet the demand. And it was in the face of that problem that I began to develop an idea for scaling up affordable housing. I'm a believer that success has many mothers and that change happens when smart and creative people work together. And the panel that we assembled today includes some of the sharpest minds and the creative thinkers in the development industry. I've known some of them for my entire professional career, and some I just met this year. But every person here brings an incredible wealth of intelligence and experience to this conversation. So I'll begin by introducing Tara Barauskas. Tara is the CEO of Community Corp of Santa Monica. She manages the 1,800 units of affordable housing and builds new housing every year, primarily in Santa Monica, but also throughout the West Side. She is a visionary and a hard worker combined, and brings many years of experience developing in both the for-profit and nonprofit affordable housing worlds. She currently is the board chair of the Southern California Association of Nonprofit Housing, SCAMF. And it was really her idea to bring this conversation forward to this conference today. The second person I'd like to introduce is David Chow. David is with IBI Group, and he is a licensed engineer, a certified planner, and he is the lead in the Los Angeles for mobility and US P3, lead in US for P3. He's a partner with the IBI firm, and IBI is a global architectural engineering firm. He's spent more than 32 years in the industry building infrastructure, planning, and designing cities. And it was really David's intelligence that brought a whole host of information about technology that we're going to talk about today. Technology and planning and site selection. Carolyn Hull is the general manager of economic and workforce development, and her claim to fame is that she joined the department as head of it 1 month before the coronavirus pandemic. And under her leadership, the Economic and Workforce Development Department of the city distributed $63 million in COVID-19 related financial and economic relief programs, including the City of Los Angeles Small Business Emergency Grant Program. Carolyn has a long history working on economic development in the City of Los Angeles, the County of Los Angeles, and brings years to the industry development, job creation, and we're really delighted to have her join us for the conversation today, which takes us past housing and into even thinking about job creation as part of the housing world. Daphne Kaplan is CEO and founder of Cassette company. Process innovation, construction, and knows enough, as she describes it, about manufacturing to be dangerous, and enough about construction to want to fix it. Prior to launching Cassette, Daphne spent 10 years in consumer products and OEM electronics sector, followed by 15 years in commercial construction and architecture. And it was Daphne, when I heard Daphne speak, that started to rethink the way I thought about housing development in Los Angeles. And finally, I'd like to introduce Sasha Wysotsky-Kurgan. Sasha is the new Deputy Secretary of Housing and Consumer Relations at the Business Consumer Services Agency, Housing Agency of California. She is the Deputy Secretary of Housing, and she will be responsible for advising on the state housing policy and leading the coordination of housing investments, programs, and activities to preserve and expand affordable housing statewide. She will work closely and provide oversight to the BCSH departments that oversee all aspects of housing, including the Department of Housing and Community Development, the California Housing Finance Agency, and the Department of Real Estate. For the past 4 years, Sasha has been with HCD, California HCD, where she integrated data and research into the HCD's priorities, and she led HCD in shaping the governor's executive order on state-owned excess sites. I met Sasha through the Excess Sites program and found her to be one of the most forward-thinking people on public land. So I'd like to share with you now, as quickly as possible, let's jump to our presentation. And then after I share with you the presentation or on the strategy, we'll open the presentation up to the panelists to reflect on the strategy. So hopefully there will be, is it somebody from SCANF going to be showing us the presentation?
I can send a note to Jeanette and see if she's still working on it.
Yeah, I have no idea how to present here because I thought we were going to be, I can pull it, let me pull it up and I will just share it from my screen. Give me 1 minute. Okay.
We can see it, Helmi.
Oh, you can? Great.
Yes.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. Okay, so the strategy is called Scaling Up Housing on Equitable Land. Can we go back for a minute? Okay. The strategy is called Scaling Up Equitable Housing on Public Land. This strategy was released in April, and we've continued to refine it going forward. And let's go to the next slide. Great. So the crux of the problem in housing is shown here. What you see in this slide is on the blue line is the RHNA, the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. And I'm sure I don't need to tell this audience what the RHNA is, but for those of you who may not be as familiar, what you need to know is that every 8 years, the City of Los Angeles and all jurisdictions in California assess the need for housing, and it's a requirement by the state. And what you can see is that looking backwards, from 2008 to 2020, the estimated need for affordable housing, which is shown here, was roughly in the neighborhood of 6,000 to 8,000 units for the City of Los Angeles. So that was the estimated need. But this year, there was a radical shift in the way the analysis was done, and it started to recognize the planners in Los Angeles recognized that there needed to be a significant increase in affordable housing. So moving forward from starting this year towards 2029, the estimated need in Los Angeles for housing that is serving households between 30% and 120% of the area median is 32,500 units. What you can see is that historically, the City of Los Angeles has struggled to produce even the old RHNA numbers. And so the question we've been faced with is how do we increase the production of affordable housing at a scale that we've never done before? Let's go to the next slide. So the idea, or the kernel of the idea that we started thinking about was, could we use public land to scale up affordable housing? And if we did that, can we build equity and sustainability into the process and the outcomes? So this is the big idea that we're trying to respond to. Let's go to the next slide. So I want to begin sharing with you how the current system in Los Angeles functions. Typically, when we dispose of public land for housing, we take surplus sites and make them available for housing development. It is a long and cumbersome process. The government starts by identifying sites, conducting a study, issuing a request for proposals, and selecting a developer, going through a competitive selection process. And once this developer is selected, at that time, both the developer and the city work together to begin the entitlements planning and do soils testing, initiate the entitlements planning, and negotiating a development agreement. When the development agreement is done, it goes back to council for approval. And at that point, the developer begins competing for local subsidies, competing for tax credits. And once they've lined up all their funding, they go for construction and then, of course, occupancy. This system has been used for a long time in the city. And the problem with it is it's a very slow process. It's 4 to 8 years. It's very staff intensive for both the developer and the city. The costs per unit on average are about $550,000 per unit. Very often they're higher than that. And the subsidies that the city needs to put in this process are land, $140,000 roughly in local subsidies per unit. And about $200,000 is coming in the form of tax credits per unit. There's many problems associated with public land. It's rarely ready to be developed. There's often multiple public owners. There's infrastructure, unfunded infrastructure like parking. There's often properties or buildings that need to be demolished or soil that's contaminated that needs to be resolved. All of these things lengthen the process and increase the cost. And so this system, takes a long time and simply it does not scale to the need. So let's move to the next slide. So the idea that we're talking about today is we're calling getting to scale. And the idea behind it is to assemble and entitle enough land to allow affordable housing developers to build at scale. So it begins with marshaling 300 acres of public land. And that 300 acres assumes that we're building 10,000 units at a development of about 50 dwelling units per acre. Then to plan those 10,000 units in advance, to develop a scalable housing model that can be replicated, and to create a housing infrastructure fund to address the costs that we talked about earlier. So let's dig in a little bit to this plan. Next slide. So first step is to marshal 300 acres of land. And we know that there's not enough readily developable land just owned by one public agency. So really to be big thinkers and to think in terms of scale, this strategy begins with talking with multiple public agencies coming together to identify land that can be developed. It might include city land, county land, state land, federal land. It could include donated land. It could include land from quasi-governmental entities such as the school districts or the community college districts. Any number of partners can be part of this. And the idea is to create a land partnership for equitable housing and to really think about the shared needs across all these public agencies for creating land. And identifying land without really thinking about over-analyzing at the beginning, but in fact, casting a broad net on land and then using technology to analyze the opportunities more carefully, rather than what happens today is a community member or a council member will drive by a parking lot and think, hey, I think that would make a great housing site. Those kinds of inputs are important, but they're preventing us, thinking site by site is preventing us from getting to scale. The idea here is to create 10 1,000 unit development opportunities. Next slide. The planning of the 10,000 units, really the concept here is to start using technology in a much more strategic way than we have in the past. So assembling a lot of land is the first step, but the next step is really using technology to begin to identify the sites. The technology that we are focused on is called Parametric Modeling, which gives us the ability to think about what are the parameters or the inputs we need to make good choices. So there might be choices that lead us towards good design because it's a corner lot or because of the site size or because the zoning is good. And there might be a site that leads us to higher outcomes in affordable housing, like proximity to good schools or proximity to open space. So the idea is to really invest upfront in the technology planning. Let's go to the next slide. So this slide shares a little bit more about how the parametric modeling might work for site selection. And as I mentioned before, it could be sites that advance equity. So near amenities that make livability really wonderful, like open space and good schools. It could be conditions that we're looking for that have to do with how to scale in terms of size, whether it's high height limits, if we can go beyond 50 dwelling units per acre and identify sites that we can do 100 or 200 units per acre, we can reduce the amount of land needed. So we're looking for zoning. We may want to look for sites that really lend themselves to modular construction, that have great site access or good roads to get the housing there. And we also want to look for opportunities for land partnerships. So we may, for example, start to look at, okay, what are all the sites that the community college has? Let's go to the next slide. The next step in the strategy is to design a scalable housing model that is replicable. The idea here is to drive down the construction cost to $300,000 per unit and make it a predictable, replicable housing unit that we can, keep the costs contained. By using modular housing, we think we can also increase rapid innovation on permit processing, reducing the time can drive up the environmental sustainability, both in terms of the unit itself and also in terms of the production process. And what we're looking for is something that is not only relatively inexpensive to build, but also has really high quality design. So it's ramping up quality while at the same time really controlling costs. So the strategy depends upon developing a pre-approved housing prototype. Next slide. Again, the parametric modeling that we talked about for site selection, we can use also to visualize the built environment to help sort of do massing studies. And this can all be done at the front end by the public sector. So rather than leaving all of the work for the developer and all the risk for the developer, the public sector can go in early and begin to identify, ask the question, not what land is excess, but rather, if we wanted to put 10,000 units of housing on public land, what are the best places to put it? And what is it going to look like in terms of density? So we can start addressing some of those questions early on in the site selection and development process. Let's go to the next slide. So another piece of the strategy is moving away from only building at the deepest levels of affordability. There's no question that the demand for housing for people who are homeless or in deeply low income have a high housing need. But this strategy says, wait a minute, I think we want to start talking about how we might leverage moderate income revenues to achieve to help us achieve a better economics for the transaction. So the model we looked at was to take 55% of the units, of 10,000 units, that would be deeply affordable, and 45% of the units that would be affordable at sort of a middle income level. We might even include first-time home buyer. The idea here is to mix the incomes broadly across the projects, not to have separate housing projects where low-income people live separately from moderate-income people, but in fact, to drive towards an average rent of about $1,700 a month, because that rent is actually going to be able to support the cost of $300,000, which is the cost of the unit. So we're trying to match up revenues from the project with the cost of the unit. And we could do this by establishing an equitable housing land trust. That might be a model where we put all of the public land into a trust and we create permanent affordability, permanent mixed income affordability that serves everyone from supportive housing serving homeless all the way to first-time home buyers and moderate first-time home buyers. Let's go to the next slide. So one of the elements of this strategy is really focusing on modular. And this is still an ongoing question within California, quite frankly. And I was originally on the fence about whether or not this was key or central to the project, and it still warrants testing. But what we're finding is that when you produce modular at scale, and I'll just say, in overseeing the tax credit program in Los Angeles, I saw thousands and thousands of units being developed. And there was really no difference in price between modular housing and stick-built housing. And I was questioning that. Why is that? Why would anybody, why would we build modular if it's not any less expensive than stick-built? What I started to realize, and after listening to speakers talk about modular, including Daphne, who's on the panel today, is that modular starts to make a real price difference at scale. When you start purchasing 1,000 units, you're now driving the cost down and creating economies of scale that we don't create in quite the same way in the stick-built environment. So it really has to do with thinking about public land, as the tail end of a manufacturing process. And so a big focus of this strategy is looking at what the production targets might be and comparing the modular and on-site construction costs and determining whether or not we could create a modular housing system that has job creation potential. So really, what is the benefits to the local economy? Can we create a local hire program? Can we create job training and apprenticeships? What would it look like if we actually were producing housing at scale in a kind of manufacturing process? And the idea is also to create a construction and workforce plan for 10,000 units. So grabbing a hold of housing at scale and trying to drive opportunity for communities through the job creation that it would create. Let's go to the next slide. So I spoke earlier about how the mixed income approach can offset the cost of the unit itself. So the idea is to drive down the cost of the unit by creating a replicable, scalable unit and having the unit paid for by the rents from the project. But you still have a lot of costs that need to be paid, and these are real development costs. So the idea here is, rather than what we do in the tax credit system, is we fund the gap at the back end. What this strategy does is it says, let's not fund the gap at the back end, but in fact, let's put our money, the public sector's money, in up front and address the infrastructure, the housing infrastructure needs. So the current model is, for 10,000 units, we would create a $500 million equitable housing infrastructure fund. And this is a very flexible fund that could be used for everything from pre-development, community engagement, site clearance and remediation of the soils. It could potentially be used to purchase or to build out the parks and the open space so that we create livable communities. It might be needed for transportation or utility infrastructure, and it could even be used for education and workforce training if we create a job strategy around it. So the infrastructure fund is actually part of it. And so the public sector is, coming in with land and funding, infrastructure funding. But even in this scenario, it works out to significantly less contribution of public sector funds than our current system. And it actually drives scale. Let's go to the next slide. So getting to scale really has 4 big ideas. First is marshaling 300 acres or enough land for 10 1,000 unit development opportunities. We're trying to identify large scale development opportunities rather than small individual projects that are 100 or 50 units. We want to think in terms of scale. The second piece is to use technology to plan 10,000 units. So use technology to identify the best places, use technology to start developing the how the site might lay out and what it would look and feel like. Develop a scalable housing model, identify a unit that we can buy over and over and over again, that's sustainable, that's cost efficient, and think about it in terms of building mixed income communities on a land trust. And then finally, begin with an infrastructure fund, a very flexible fund that will address the risks and costs upfront, understanding that affordable housing needs the public sector to lead, needs public sector investment, but our goal is to create scale, to drive down cost, and to have a really high quality communities and high quality housing that serves everybody. I think that is it. Let's go to the last slide. Thank you. And so now what we'll do is we'll turn to the panel and get some reflections from our team. So I'd like to begin with Tara. Tara, you've been at the forefront of building affordable housing in Los Angeles. You've done numerous tax credit projects, and you currently manage thousands of affordable housing units. You reached out to me after this plan was released, and you asked me to share the presentation with the SCANF board. And so my question I'd like to ask you is, can you share your perspective as an affordable housing developer on what interests you? And do you think this is the type of thing that traditional affordable housing developers could do?
Great. Yeah. And thanks so much, Helmi. And to everyone who worked on this idea and this report, I have to say, as Helmi mentioned, when I read the report, I was blown away. And I think that's because it really highlights so many things that I've been thinking about. I am what you would consider a traditional affordable housing developer. We have, as you said in the report, a strong ecosystem of such organizations that are nonprofit, mission-oriented, very experienced developers and operators of affordable housing, which is, I think, a real asset that our region has. But I will say, as was mentioned in the report, the system and the tools that we've been given are not optimized to meet the level of need is, I guess, sort of one of my big takeaways. And I was like, yeah, that's exactly the challenge we've been having. I think, the North Star is all of our North Star that you mentioned in the report, which is we want to address homelessness and poverty. And so, the situation has gotten obviously dire in the city and county of LA lately. And so I think it is time to step back outside of the system, which, look, we have a system that's been working. We've been producing thousands of units of affordable housing in our region every year. And we really appreciate our partnerships with all of our governmental partners, tax credit investors, and banks. And, I think we've got a program, like I said, that is producing. But I think we can do more, and we can do it better and more efficiently. And so when I read the report, I just said, wow, like this is, exactly what I've been thinking about. And I think many of us, is we're all working project by project and cobbling together 4 or 5 sources of funding. And, I just think there's a better way. And so the scaling up idea that you presented here, is really something I think a lot of us would be interested in. I know one of the questions was, could our group of affordable housing developers meet the capacity to scale up like this? And I think absolutely the answer is yes. I think for groups like us, the constraining factor with not building as much housing as is needed has been financing. So I think finding the efficiencies in financing. So i.e., bringing costs down, finding more funding sources. And I think if we had that, we could scale up our own operations, like our own development teams, to produce a lot more housing. And something I've been intrigued about for a while, but haven't been able to figure out, is how do we look beyond project by project, and so into these sort of bigger like 500,000 unit kind of models. I think this is exactly where that conversation should be going. So I think those were the reasons that I got excited, and I think what I really liked about the idea, of course, public land, it's not like, it's been something we've been using and it's been talked about, but I think when we're talking about utilizing all of it and really getting it out there, I know City of LA has started to put some RFPs out, but I think thinking bigger picture and more holistically would really help us. I know in talking to some groups, and I think you'll hear from them today, about how do we really start to get some efficiencies in terms of construction costs. That's one of the answers, is you need to build a larger quantity of units at the same time, or find ways to have bigger contracts or pools so that you can start to get some cost efficiency. I think, one of the challenges developers have faced, in particular over, say, the last 5 years or so, is this both perception and reality that it's too expensive to build affordable housing. And we would all love for the cost to be less, but the reality is that we have to buy everything from the same marketplace that market rate developers and everyone else has to buy from. So construction materials, land, all the services that we pay for. So finding ways to create more cost efficiency on all of those fronts is great. I do think modular has some promise as well, and I think we're going to talk more about that. So, and then the last thing I'll just say that I really appreciated about the report is the idea that not only can we scale up, but we can make sure we're being intentional and doing it right. So thinking about who we're serving, make sure that the housing is actually benefiting those people who need it the most, and making it sustainable, building it near transit and jobs. So I really see a lot of hope in this idea, and I'm excited to see what SCAMP and all of us developers can do to make this happen. So I think I'll stop there for now.
Great. Thank you, Tara. I don't know. I want to just do a quick check because your sound was going in and out for me. Can everybody hear? Did everybody hear Tara just fine? Okay, good. Then it might just be my computer. Really, really helpful. Appreciate your perspective on that. And I am glad to know that you think that that affordable housing developers can get into working at scale, because I think that is essential. The next question I'd like to ask is to Sasha. You have been at the forefront of excess land disposition at the state, so you have a very big picture perspective on that. And I'd like to ask you, what do you think it would take for public agencies to work together to assemble enough land for 10,000 units? And which agency do you think should make the first move?
It is such a good question. It's probably going to take me a little bit to answer all of that. But first, I'm just so excited about this panel and so excited about the discussion, and really appreciate the opportunity to kind of zoom out and think about this with such a group of folks. For the rest of the group, our prep call was great. So I'm excited about the conversation today. But I think for public agencies to work together, it's going to require comprehensive inventories of land, a lot of goal setting and communication. The good news is that there's statutory authority, policy tools, and planning grants available to help get to the scale. All of that is already available. As you mentioned, Helmi, I've been working on the state excess sites program. I should share with the group, I am coming to the conversation with some optimism here. In my time at HCD, having the governor put forward an executive order within his first week of being appointed, requiring the state to make an inventory, got my affordable housing ears perked up, and I was really honored to get to work on that. But aside from that, at HCD, we were also they still are working on implementation of the Surplus Land Act, which requires local agencies, as you described, to make land available and a current revision to, or recent revision to the Surplus Land Act required local agencies to make land available for affordable housing before selling or leasing the land for other purposes, which is a significant change. So it kind of gives an opportunity for action as you're describing. So to unpack those things that I mentioned, sorry, this is the time when my cat decided to wake up, so excuse me. So to get everybody to work together, the land inventory is so important, as you mentioned, but here we're not starting from scratch and there's a lot of public land available. So on the state side, we made our inventory available of excess property. That includes small infill sites. I know not the hope of what we're talking about today, but also large campus properties. And that inventory is dynamic, which I think is healthy for any agency to think about the inventory of public land. Now we're thinking about office buildings that might be underutilized as well, right? So to think about the inventory as dynamic, and that inventory at the state level can continue to grow beyond the 100 or so state sites which are on there now. Then there are other inventories available. So for the first time, cities and counties reported to HCD this year their current inventories of surplus land. HCD is compiling that data now. Also, you talked a little bit about the regional housing need allocation, or RHNA, how that ends up fitting into the housing element process. So for the first time, HCD is collecting housing element sites inventories because they gained authority to collect these electronically from cities and counties. And all those sites on the sites inventory are sites which are identified to accommodate the RHNA. Some of those sites will include public land available. So we need to map and evaluate all of those inventories that I described together, and use geographic information system, other policy ideas, and ways to think about proximity of those sites to transit, other planned investments. I know David's going to cover some of this now. It doesn't mean that GIS needs to be the end all be all. There are other tools, but there can be some cursory checks. So I think that's a way to kind of activate the inventories. I could go on about the Surplus Land Act. I will just say briefly that it's not just the inventories, but local agencies actually making the land available through noticing processes. And there have been nearly 1,000 notices of availability released since the beginning of 2020, when HCD stepped into this part of implementation. So it is not nothing. And of that land, not all of it ends up being used for housing. But since the beginning of this year, on track to have almost 1,500 units created by, less than a couple hundred dispositions, not all of them focused on housing. So there is volume that's coming from this public land. And so I think the strategy of looking at inventory comprehensively can help scale. But aside from the inventories, goal setting among public agencies has to be really important in this conversation. So again, the housing element process, the regional housing need allocation gets cities, counties, and regions thinking about where housing can happen. But I think that goal setting has to flow deeply into communication among public agencies. I think you've tapped into all the right things in your presentation, but I can't understate the real conversations that would be needed at the local level to come to agreement on that housing prototype. And I think, not having analysis paralysis get to be the better of those conversations. I think that here's where I would bring optimism. I think the cost efficiency which you're offering could be the right motivation to get people to the table and make decisions there. But that motivation should also, and conversation also needs to flow into those infrastructure investments. So all this leading up to who would act first. And I think it is in the regional space or at the county level. County of Los Angeles feels like its own region with all of the cities within it. And I was excited about some, prior initiatives and thinking about preservation as a regional opportunity. And so public land could also think about housing development as a regional opportunity. But regional entities could, so I'm thinking of SCAG, I'm thinking of SANDAG, could evaluate land inventory for the whole region in concert with their sustainable community strategies and the large transit investments in mind. And they are kind of, to Tara's point, thinking about how we consider those infrastructure investments that will be required for transportation that housing can benefit from, right? When we know that there's a specific plan, when we know that there's light rail coming in, that gets housers thinking, great, we should align, think about the street improvements that are going to need to happen, think about siting, all kinds of things. So to kind of bring some of this together, I'd just say, the state has been for the past few years making available planning grants to cities, counties, and to regional agencies, all to think about ways to expedite housing. And housing at the scale and pace that you're suggesting could certainly expedite production and would be a really fantastic outcome for some of the planning grants and the deep work that's been happening at the local and regional level. So I think the time is right, Helmi.
Wow, I'm super hopeful listening to you, and I'm very excited for you in your new role because you're going to be bringing all these different departments together. So I'm sure we're going to continue to want to speak with you. One thing I want to mention is that, I don't think we're looking necessarily for a single site that has that you can put 1,000 units on. It may be a scattered site or a group of sites together with the idea that the sites collectively can put 1,000 units on. And so now actually I want to turn to David because thinking about how to identify sites and figure all that out is going to, and thinking about technology, I would just say, David Chow, you were one of the most influential people in my thinking on this because of your knowledge. The firm that you work with really marries technology with architecture and engineering and planning. And I learned a lot from you. And so I was just going to ask you, can you tell us what parametric modeling is? And then in a more broad context, in what ways do you think that technology can help rethink government processes for land use and development?
Well, Helmi, thank you for such kind words. I would say in the same way that I've just heard you influence, that my discussions with you have influenced you, you've done the same for me. This whole topic that we're talking about and the panel members you've gathered is so amazing because it's really looking at how do we do things better. And at the heart of it, the parametric planning process, it's really just a fancy word, I think, for leveraging all this new information that we've accumulated. Sasha really hit the nail on the head when she said there's so much information already in various sources, whether it's GIS or other databases. But the problem that we have is analysis paralysis. There's too much to look at. And at the heart of it, what parametric planning is trying to do is to say, let's harness that data, but let's go one step further. Let's code into it the thinking process. Take the expertise that we have as leaders in our field, whether it's on the planning side or the engineering side, code that into the software and let that intelligence run through scenarios. And where that really comes in very powerfully is scale, right? It goes back to the other point that was mentioned before. I think it was by you actually, Helmi, when you mentioned that there's so much work that needs to be done ahead of time. And also at a level that is more on a regional scale. It's very difficult, I think, for individual agencies or developers even to look at that large scale. So doing an analysis at a regional level, coding in all of those aspects that we would use to identify the best sites, not just sites that fit, but sites that are actually going to be optimal. Let the machine run through its analysis. And this could be hundreds, thousands, even millions of different scenarios and iterations. And then let that process find the top 10 locations. Now we take it from the machine side and we apply it to our creative human thinking, where we can actually say, okay, of these 10 sites, how might we creatively design the site to fit, whether it's the mix of uses or whether it's the configuration of that development. That's where parametric planning, I think, is really going to accelerate and promote the concept that we're talking about, which is scaling things up. Because now if we've had the ability to look at it regionally and pick the top 10 sites, which can meet the criteria of size and scale and accessibility and all of those aspects, now we can really start to talk about something. Leading into your other point about how might that be woven into the government process. We all know that it's very difficult for government to use the latest and greatest tools, right? Because part of this is the public trust of saying you're not just going to apply any new idea that's unproven to do something. And I think therein lies the challenge for government, is that government is aware that there are all of these new tools that happen, but at the same time, they still have to hold back to that mandate of, has it been proven for the past 30 years, so that we're not doing anything that's too risky. And I would say a suggestion to think about this is not so much that it's a new tool as it is you are now moving towards a data-driven decision, that you are now basically culling that information and giving all of the decision makers and stakeholders as much information as possible to make the right choice. So it's really a change in how we think about these tools and the data. And let's face it, that's where our whole world is going now, right? Everything is data driven. There's too much data. And what it is it's just about a process to harness that information to make decisions. Does that answer the question, would you say, Helmi? Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you. I want to ask you, which public agencies do you think can really harness this data? Sasha mentioned MPOs being essential to this process. Do you think MPOs are where it needs to be done, or are there other places that might be able to do this kind of using technology to think forward?
Great question, Helmi. And I failed to say that this process isn't simply a large regional process. It could be taken all the way down to the parcel level. So from that perspective, I would say agencies at all levels. You could start with the MPOs because they certainly have the regional perspective and have the regional data, but it can go all the way down to a local housing department or planning department. When you want to get right down into the specifics of, okay, now that we have a site and it's an optimal site, how might we optimally configure it? What might be the range of mixes in the land use? How might that building and the massing look? This process is really about letting some artificial intelligence take on the brute force work of doing the analysis. So yeah, I would say agencies at all levels.
Cool, thank you. Very, very, really interesting to work with you and to try to think about technology in the public sector. And another person who brought a lot of intelligence, changed my thinking around using technology is Daphne Kaplan. So the strategy calls for the development of 10 1,000 unit development opportunities, based on this idea that government can use its purchasing power to purchase modular housing in bulk, and that would significantly reduce the cost. And the first time I heard about that idea was from you, Daphne. And so I want to ask you, can you give us your perspective on how to create economies of scale in modular housing? And do you see a role that government can play to advance lower cost housing solutions?
Thank you, Helmi. You honor me with your words, and I stand on a lot of shoulders as well. So I'm going to give a couple of shout outs. One is in your slide deck when you showed, I think, the strategy around 1,000 at a time. You had a picture of a modular student housing project. And that was one of the early modular projects by my business partner, Randy Miller, who really was a pioneer in modular, not only in California, but in the country. He had a factory called Rad Urban at the time. And I've learned much of what I understand about this specific type of manufacturing from him, as well as a lot of people in the modular community. And then your quote, "Success has many mothers." This is critical when you're talking about modular and where we are today, if it's going to succeed. And so what I'm going to address with your question, I'm going to put a slide up here because I think it's important, if I can get this, is that when we talk about scale and manufacturing, and hold on, I think it's really important for folks to understand why scale works in manufacturing. And not all manufacturing is created equal. Did that go up? Okay, so you may be familiar with this chart ad nauseum. It was produced by McKinsey some, I don't know, it's probably 6 years ago now. And it's a lot of sort of the the argument in the VC communities around why to invest in prefabrication, things like Katera, things like modular construction, is there's just this stunning gap between productivity gains in the last 20, 30 years in manufacturing versus construction. And they're saying that, look, if construction could get just to the average, it would be worth something like $1.6 trillion a year to the global economy. So this is just a simplistic way to explain why so many people are looking at manufacturing. What I want to just help this group see is that scale works to drive cost down in manufacturing in two different ways. If you're talking about sort of fairly simple manufacturing, like these plastic glasses, the tool that you do a lot of design work up front, and then you pay a lot of money for these form tools for things like plastics, with the thought that you're going to then either injection mold or do other forms of sort of repetition in the thousands, right? But other forms of manufacturing that probably better replicate what you're doing in construction would be automotive manufacturing or aerospace manufacturing, or even in our industry, there's a precedent at a smaller scale in elevator manufacturing or air conditioning. And manufacturing in those sectors has also equally improved by a constant. And there is sort of a law in manufacturing that's been well understood since the 30s that cost savings over scale is not necessarily on a one production run basis, because it's not necessarily about leveraged buying. It's not because there's a lot of people who've jumped into this industry thinking if we could just increase our buying power to get these construction materials, those prices will come down dramatically. And what's been proven in most complex manufacturing is that actually the cost savings is primarily coming from process improvement. And so sit with that for a moment. So the process, because you think about even how modulars created in the factories, yes, there's incremental gains from robotics, but where are the actual savings coming from? It's coming from process improvement. So what happens when every time, what if we ordered a refrigerator the way that we build housing? Well, we would get different product designers and we would get them to draw a schematic for a refrigerator, and we'd build the prototype in our kitchen, and it might cost what we thought and it might not, right? And then we'd go to the next house and we'd buy a completely different refrigerator. And you can see that by doing this with modular or any kind of prefab construction, you're shutting yourself off from the process improvement that could happen over project to project to project, from the folks who are making it happen both in the manufacturing environment and on the site where it's getting married. So there is a process improvement that is more likely to be able to happen in a factory if the factory has enough of a leap of faith from clients, or sort of a push from the regulatory side to incentivize clients to move toward purchasing a standardized product. But there's also the benefit of standardization in some ways for the general contractor community, for the architects and engineers that are taking that product and having to marry it to what's being done on site. And so this is a really smart group of people on the panel, but I'm assuming also in the audience, overeducated for your pay grade. And I'm not going to tell you how to create that, because to Helmi's point, this is a village level change. And so what I'm asking for as a representative of this sort of modular industry, and I'm asking this very specifically of my clients, but also of the ecosystem, is two leaps of faith. So one is the leap to believe that if we make a commitment to a product, if that product today cost exactly the same as building it on site, which is what most modular companies are telling you, I have a 100-unit project, it looks like the construction cost is the same, but I save a little time. The leap of faith I'm asking for is for the whole community to invest in the product development around that standardized product, and to say we're willing to take that product and keep buying it like a Lego, to enable that factory to save, we would estimate, 10% on their costs every time they double how many times they've done it. That's the constant in process improvement. It's that if I'm building one airplane versus 2 versus 4 versus 8 versus 16, I have a constant percentage savings over time. And in modular, that happens to be around 10% at the factory level, plus or minus. So leap of faith, sort of on both sides. On the client side, the leap of faith would be really a process of being open book, because there is this mistaken notion, that if I just don't tell people what my budget is, I'll get a more competitive price. And I hope that's not where this group is necessarily leaning. My experience in commercial construction was you always got a better price when you gave people an incentive not to be deceptive about the price, but to actually, like, let's work through the product together. Let's design it to the cost we need it to be and get it there. And then let's take that leap of faith that over time it's going to go from the 400,000 a unit down to 300,000 over a number of projects. So whether that bulk buying is done at the government level or at the client level, or the government sort of facilitating that process for manufacturing, is sort of up to everyone in the room.
Interesting. So I guess, we've kind of shifted a little bit from just talking about housing to talking about actually industry and industry strategy. We're actually kind of talking about creating a new industry around housing in the modular world. And affordable housing industry has always been a driver for local construction jobs at good wages. And so I want to ask Carolyn, from your perspective in economic development, what can we do to ensure prevailing wage construction jobs stay in the local economy and that LA residents have a chance to be employed in those jobs if we move in this direction?
Well, first of all, Helmi, when you first presented this plan to me, I thought it was an innovative approach to addressing the housing crisis. But this type of scaling and long-term planning would also allow for a holistic approach to economic and workforce development in developing a plan that would look at how we could increase, and I'll get to how we could do that, local hiring, which would result in an increased number of living wage middle-skilled jobs. And by what I mean by middle-skill jobs are those opportunities for which you only requires less than a 4-year degree, but more than a high school degree. And when we say living wage, it's the amount of wages that would be required to live in this region. The construction industry, by its very nature, has numerous occupations that are living wage and middle skill. So this type of planning would allow us to completely model the number of carpenters we may need, the number of electricians that would be needed to develop this number of units. Thereby, working with our regional community colleges, we can ensure that we have enough training programs to actually meet those skills and to meet the changing skills of construction. Because the skills that one needs in this type of modular world and in other forms of construction may not simply be that you can be a carpenter. You may now need to actually be able to read CAD drawings or have I was looking at Factory OS's job listings, and they were looking for app developers. So there's a changing structure in the jobs that will be needed and those skills that will be needed. So in order for us to ensure, there's two issues here. One is that we have to make sure that we have the right number of people in the right occupations. There's already a shortage of skilled construction workers. That's where we bring in our community colleges. But the public sector can also ensure that there's local hire. And what local hire means is that you work with work source centers potentially, and making sure that you give opportunities to those individuals who live in those communities. And thereby kind of dealing with this issue of poverty as well. So not only are we dealing with the housing crisis, but we're also potentially looking at a way to uplift the per capita wages in this region. If we kind of look at this from a way that government can play a role and looking at how do we actually, when we're putting together these housing plans, we also have a workforce plan. And that workforce plan can't just be government. We have to have a more holistic approach that brings in our training centers, that brings in our community colleges, and also addressing the fact that we can bring in our youth so that they can understand how these jobs can, what the jobs of the future can be. And in working with organizations like my department, the Economic and Workforce Development Department, we could potentially use WIOA dollars for apprenticeships and internships, whereby we actually are taking some of those costs away from the employer themselves. So kind of, again, the goal here is to have not just a plan to how we look at the housing, but how we look at the occupations and modeling those occupations that'll be needed to bring about this plan. But I don't want to stop there. I want to also look at the supply chain. When you bring in materials and goods that'll be needed for this type of construction, how do we make sure that we have entrepreneurs in the region who can address the needs so that we're not importing the goods and services from other areas, but building an ecosystem that can support this type of growth? And that, again, will require long-term planning, but this sort of scaling up allows us all to do that. I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Carolyn. When listening to you kind of makes me think a little bit about, Sasha is now sitting in this seat where she's going to be bringing together both business strategy and housing. And I kind of go back to this conversation about, or this question about which agency goes first. I mean, how do we bring alignment to the, you're sitting as the head of economic and workforce development in Los Angeles. What would it take for you to be in a conversation with the head of housing, or is there a statewide analog to bringing agencies together? And maybe Carolyn and Sasha, if you could both address that, I'd be interested.
Well, Sasha, you go first.
This is Carolyn's expertise for sure. But I will say, last year in pandemic response, we were thinking about what we needed to do within housing. We worked on home key, but we were also thinking about massive job loss and also the existing housing crisis and needing to figure out how to still expedite development. So there were more conversations about the job ecosystem for housing. And one thing that I'd offer is that, what's been on my mind is that folks think about construction as housing jobs, but we also think about, and for affordable housing developers and long-term owners, they know that there's long-term jobs in maintenance, operations, and services. So I really want to encourage us thinking about, I know we're talking about scaling development, and that is important, but for the long-term management, I think that this is what can allow folks like Carolyn and me to speak more comprehensively about construction apprenticeship programs. Yes, and the state had expanded in the last governor's budget some apprenticeship programs. So a lot of work there, a lot of focus on this, not just in major metropolitan areas, but really thinking about how we activate the whole state in this regard. And then I think the challenge is to kind of get people thinking about the broader housing job ecosystem so that we're thinking about that education to housing career pipeline that may have you working in a factory on modular, but it may have you thinking about we have architects and engineers and lawyers like, I love playing this game. Tell me what your interest is, and I can find you a way for you to work in housing. So I want more of these conversations. And Carolyn's expertise on the federal funding that's available is so far beyond mine. So I welcome the conversation whenever.
Well, then, Sasha, I think and I welcome the conversation with you at the state, and maybe what our next move should be is that the economic and workforce development folks locally and regionally at the county meet with the state. We can start looking at what's in our pipeline now. There's no reason not to do what we're talking about now, because the reality is that we have an opportunity to reduce the poverty levels by increasing the employment in these living wage middle skill jobs. And we have a pipeline. So I encourage it. I would say that we should have a follow-up meeting with and get the right people around the table so we can actually move some of these federal dollars and train people and get them on work sites.
So I want to, this is phenomenal. And, I'm looking now at Q&A. I'd like to open it up and bring in some questions from the audience. And I'm going to begin with question that's been posed by my former friend and colleague, Sally Richmond from the Housing Department. And she's asking two really interesting questions. So I'm going to ask them both at the same time, and then let me, whoever wants to weigh in on this is welcome to. So the first question is this approach anticipating 1,000 units on one site? If so, it would require planning for community serving retail, elementary school, et cetera, et cetera. So bigger picture beyond just housing, thinking in terms of community serving amenities. And then kind of along the same veins, she said, are there any applicable lessons that we've learned from military base closure programs that were supposed to provide land for affordable housing, but didn't because NIMBY obstacles got in the way? So does anyone want to volunteer to talk about this? Kind of respond to both planning for community and also concerns about NIMBYism?
I can touch on a little bit on the first one. Related to amenities, that is part of the process that we've done when evaluating state sites. And this is why I've loved talking to David, because we can map existing amenities. We can think about how many people might live in a development and where there are gaps, whether it be a food desert or additional schools, aside from the other infrastructure that might be required to support all of this. So community serving retail is a conversation that we've had with cities when we're approaching an excess site solicitation to say, you have any corner store conversion grants here? Because there's a corner store here that doesn't serve any fresh foods. But might you be able to support them? Because that helps us think about whether or not the developer needs to partner to bring in food to this development, or if you guys are handling it here. So like those conversations can all be triggered by the data. But so yeah, I think that there's a lot of opportunity there. And then I would just kind of tee up for the second question from Sally, just to say that I think that conversations about amenities are really important to community conversations when we're thinking about neighborhood change, because so often it seems conversations can draw to a halt when it's just about the housing, when really this is a conversation about amenities. It's a conversation about improving infrastructure, promoting resilience at a community level for existing and new residents. So I can't speak to the closures as much, but just to say that I think that there's an intersection there.
Look, I just want to piggyback off of what Sasha just said, because first of all, we at the city have a good food zone program where we provide grants for the kind of conversions that you're talking about in terms of like looking if there's not a corner store. And that's the sort of kind of leveraging of dollars that we really have to have, like that the data can start the conversation, but we actually are able to do that in terms of the partnership. And again, I can't speak to the base closures, but it is about community involvement and understanding the resiliency that we're going to need to move forward, and maybe making that part of our general plan and community plan updates, and talking about things that are by right in terms of having those conversations at the appropriate times when the planning is done, so that when the development is done, it can just occur because these conversations have been already carried out and part of the general plan and community plans.
Right, and I was just going to chime in that I think
I apologize. I could not hear what you said. It was coming in and out. So if anyone else on the panel wants to respond or comment, I'd invite you to say something.
Tara's about to.
Yes. Well, a couple of things. Carolyn, I wanted to piggyback a little bit off what you were saying in that.
David, did you want to chime in here?
Tara's.
Oh, yeah, I was going to let Tara finish, and then I might have something to add too. Go ahead, Tara.
Yeah, I think maybe Helmi has a little bit of a delay. But anyway, I wanted to talk a little bit about what Carolyn was talking about, which is a little bit of the bigger picture nexus about economic empowerment, because really that's what we're trying to get at. So I think thinking about workforce development is a really critical component of this idea. And I would love to brainstorm more perhaps with this group about how do you also provide, for example, affordable small business spaces that could be within some of these communities that we could be talking about. Because really, when you think about well-being, you think about amenities, but also the ability to be able to live and work in your own community and not have a 2-hour commute. So thinking about sort of well-being principles, I think is a really great opportunity when you're talking about scaling, because you can really try to create, back into what we want to see for our city and try to create all those principles in the project.
And I was just going to add that part of that parametric analysis approach is also bringing in the voice of the community, where we can actually represent that within the model itself to say, here are all the things that we've heard from the community that they would like to see as amenities. Now let's run through those scenarios and see
I just
how
want to thank you, Tara. I keep catching little bits of what people are saying. I'm having difficulty on the Wi-Fi front. I do want to mention to the audience that if you have questions you'd like to pose, please feel free to put them into the Q&A or into the chat. Probably better in the Q&A. It'll be easier to see. I want to ask another question is, what do you think about the infrastructure fund? How important is that? And, any thoughts on what that should be, what the fund should be available for? One of the concerns I want to mention that I've heard is that financing modular is different than financing regular stick-built construction. And so, what should we be thinking about financially to take on a scaled approach like this?
Well, I'd be happy to address that, but I think David has to. I think David's going to finish what he was saying, Helmi. I'll give you sign language.
Just to finish my thought.
Thank
Just to finish my thought, I was going to say that with parametric analysis, what we're able to do is actually bring in the opinions, the thoughts, the questions of the community, and model that as part of the overall analysis. And that power is not only represented in showing the community that we are listening to them, but you can actually see the results. Where we can say, with these amenities, these are the impacts that can result from it, and how might that fit? I know oftentimes when we look at development scenarios, we're really just talking to them about the things that upset them. So I'd like to also change the dialogue to talk about what are the things that might make you energized or make you feel like you're being heard and that this is going to result in a much better community that you want to build. So there's a lot of power to this parametric approach to life. I'll pass it back to Daphne on the infrastructure question.
Sure. So just with respect to modular, I think there's a couple very critical pieces that every startup modular or emerging modular company faces, and the clients face, especially in affordable. And that is, yes, the financing, which means, I think what Helmi's referring to is putting down a pretty hefty deposit that a construction lender can't wrap their head around, because you're not building it on site. So you're not building something of value that they can lend against on site. And so it's particularly hard to get the banking community to pay the upfront deposit that's required to get the whole manufacturing line set up for that project. So that's one bit. And then the other bit is, I think, the incentive to develop your modular system as a product and get it certified as such at the state level is expensive. And usually one affordable housing development pro forma cannot cover that within the pro forma. And so grants, I think, for maybe joined up client and modular company, or just for companies that are trying to build and standardize the products, small grants to do the prototype and certification process to get that labeled as an acceptable California product. It's done at the state level, but that is a chunk of finance that's not a huge number, but it doesn't fit within a typical pro forma.
If I can just piggyback on that, Daphne, I think the issue that you raise is a very important one. If there are associated infrastructure costs, upgrades to existing infrastructure, it's very difficult on a single project basis to really make an impact on that. And I think this speaks to the scale aspect of what Helmi has presented. The bigger the scale, the more capacity you have to address those associated costs of improving the infrastructure to connect to. So it really reinforces the idea that we need to think more broadly about these opportunities.
Yeah, and back to the refrigerator analysis on factory built. Like, if you are not willing to cover that separately, that prototype is going to be built in somebody's kitchen, and we can do better.
So shifting away from the costs, I'd like to ask a different question completely. One of the things that we didn't touch on in this conversation is the community land trust model and actually the long-term management of housing. And I want to actually ask you, Tara, from your vantage point, do you think that what would it take to manage, to add 1,000 units and manage 1,000 units of affordable or mixed income housing? And does the community land trust model seem to make sense to you if we put public land on a trust?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a capacity perspective, it wouldn't be an issue. I think with community land trust,
You're on mute.
Oh, can people hear me? No. Okay. Yeah, I think from a capacity issue, it would work just fine in terms of managing larger scale units. Look, it's the same kind of work, kind of what the same principle Daphne was saying. If you're, putting the infrastructure to make one refrigerator, you could do 100, right? Same thing with affordable housing development. If you're building 20 units, you can build 200. It's the same exact process, right? So, but it's really, different funding. On the community land trust front, I think it is an interesting opportunity. I guess I don't know if it would be more for home ownership or rental. I think, on the rental front, we already know how to do that. We operate affordable housing under that model, and that would be very easy to do, especially under this kind of a framework. If you're talking about affordable home ownership, which I think is a wonderful idea, and I think we should try to figure that out, that would require some more unique funding that we would need to figure out that is not currently there.
Anybody else want to add to that conversation?
I'd just say, I think that there was some research that came. Real quick, some research that came from a graduate student at UCLA Luskin for their client project over the last year, because the city council in Los Angeles had directed an exploration of publicly owned land to consider if there were opportunities for land trusts to engage there. So some kind of new research coming out that I've been keeping my eye on. And also on the state excess site side, there's one development in the pipeline that includes a partnership with a for-profit affordable developer and a local community land trust. And so they're exploring that partnership. But I think, at minimum, and I can't speak to the homeownership component, but just to say that the fact that the land trust is embedded in the community and understood existing housing needs was so helpful to the community conversation. And I think they will be an important partner to that development. So I think it's definitely worth further exploration to figure out how we can bring everybody to. I think there's a lot of space, is something that I should say, for scaling up at this size. It's important to look to folks that have been doing affordable housing development, and also anybody else that has an interest and a commitment to doing this kind of work. So I think the more space we can carve out, the better.
Great, thank you. Yeah, there is a question that from David Odusanya asking whether or not there's been conversations regarding partnering with existing land trusts. And at this point, it's all the conversations have been pretty informal. But I think that it's good to hear that there's stuff happening in other places. Do you know what city? Could you share with us where that land trust is happening on excess sites? Sasha?
Yeah, that's in South Lake Tahoe. So not a place that is has, a ton of affordable housing available. And that's a partnership with Related, and I'm not going to remember the name of the land. It might be the St. John's Land Trust that is there. So they're working together on that. The exploration for the research project for UCLA was different, and that was directed by City Council. And I think it's the Land Trust in South LA. So we're super excited to see how that work can grow.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity to think about partnerships. From my own point, I've been looking very closely at how the city of Vienna places its public land. It does a lot of development of large-scale housing of mixed income, but they call it social housing on land trusts. And I'm looking at the land trust models there, but haven't really engaged in any formal way with the land trusts in Los Angeles or other regions. Very interested in doing that, though. Well, I don't see any other questions from the community. Are there any questions that the panel would like to raise?
How do we continue the dialogue?
Comment.
Because I think this is actually a really interesting topic where I think we should actually continue it as a team. And I'm just curious as to how we would continue it with us and anyone who's present who would want to join the conversation. So Helen, if you can hear me, how do you suggest we do that?
I do hear you, and I will say that I think the first step is I'd love to ask this panel and potentially SCAMF to help us convene maybe a committee to discuss this. I mean, Tara, do you think that's something SCAMF might be open to taking some leadership on?
Absolutely, yeah, I think we would love to, and I'll reach back out to Alan on that.
Great. Yeah, I saw one of the comments was, what can philanthropy do? Any thoughts on what philanthropy can do?
I mean, I think we would love to have philanthropy as a partner. So we will find a place for them to partner with us. I think, one of the things, going back to something I said, is going to some of the non-direct housing things that are really critically important for well-being that sometimes are hard to get funded. So I think there are absolutely gaps that we will need help from philanthropy on.
Yeah.
And if I may, go ahead, Daphne.
What I would say is that on the just innovation in general, and Carolyn and I were speaking before the panel about this, which is, there are places in the world that modular and industrialized construction has been working for decades. And those are namely places that had to, like Sweden and Norway, places that have maybe 3 hours of sunlight a day. So from a technical standpoint, they've been doing it for years, but their entire ecosystem of regulatory and lending, everything is built around that, including their unions are like factory union versus site. It's all orchestrated around that. And where we have barriers I've noted some of the fiscal barriers that we have and the financing barriers. Those are the places where I think philanthropy can step in before the ecosystem is able to sort of get itself there. I think banks eventually get themselves there because actually it's much safer to lend against something that's a predetermined price than like a change order infested sort of site built traditional project. But the banks are not there yet. And so to grease the wheels in the Bay Area, there is a woman who left the mayor's office to start a nonprofit just to fill those like insurance and financing gaps. So I think there's a lot on our side that I could see if someone wants to chat with me about it.
That's great. Well, we only have 1 minute left, so I first want to just thank all the panelists so much for your participation, for your intelligence, and for your just general good humor. It's been great getting to spend time with all of you planning for this, and also I really look forward to working with you on these ideas going forward. And I want to thank SCAMF and all the audience. There's been 115 people in this session, so really appreciative of everybody who's stuck around despite my audio problems, and we welcome you into this conversation and appreciate your just being with us on this panel. So thank you so much. And that's our time.